Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. Like many people in the US, I was introduced to the work of John Steinbeck when I was assigned Of Mice and Men in high school. This was the last reading assignment of my last year of high school, so I think I also associated with that sense of freedom that you have when you go like, oh my gosh, I am about to finish high school, finally. But I absolutely fell in love with this novella, with its economy, with its descriptions, its dialogue, of course, the use of foreshadowing here. So as soon as I read this and I finished high school, I remember I went out and I bought every book by Steinbeck that I could find, preferably in these editions, because I really like it when my books match. So I looked for those. And I remember reading all of them, basically. The Pearl, The Grapes of Wrath, Travels with Charlie, East of Eden, Tortilla Flat, Cannery Row, you name it, I read it. Now, it was quite a long time before I returned to the fictional world of John Steinbeck. I have no idea why, but he is an author that I associate primarily with my first semester of college, because that's when I was reading him, right after high school. And it took me a while, for some reason, to go back to his novels. But there was one novel that I said to myself, okay, this is the one that I want to try next. And that's the one that I'm going to tell you about today. This is the latest book that I have read by John Steinbeck, In Dubious Battle. So I really enjoyed it, and this is the one that I want to explore with you for these Nobel Prize videos that I have been doing. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to share with you the Nobel Prize citation. John Steinbeck received the Nobel Prize in Literature in the year 1962, quote, for his realistic and imaginative writings, combining as they do sympathetic humor and keen social perception. Now, I want to tell you, there's definitely a lot more keen social perception than sympathetic humor in Dubious Battle. Okay, so that is one thing that we do want to say. And as a matter of fact, this novel signifies a departure for Steinbeck if you compare it to his first works. And in part, he published this book because he wanted to sort of stay away from the label of humorist that had been applied to him basically, you know, after the publication of his first works. So this is a rather dark piece if you look at his entire corpus. So the first thing I would like to do is to place In Dubious Battle in the context of John Steinbeck's works, because I think this will allow us to compare it to what came before and also to what came after. In Dubious Battle was published in the year 1936, so that means it was the year after Tortilla Flat. And then the following year, in 1937, we have Of Mice and Men, and of course in 1939 we have The Grapes of Wrath, which many people consider to be, for many valid reasons, his masterpiece, or at least the work that is most representative of his concerns, his style, the type of character that he likes to work with, etc. And I'm going to say that in a way, In Dubious Battle contains elements of both Of Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath. So this is the comparison that I wanted to make as we approach this novel. As in Of Mice and Men and many works of US literature, you have at the center the figures of two men who are friends, companions, you know, compañeros, or however you want to look at it. And these men in this case are Mac and Jim. Mac is a rather stable figure, I would say. It is Jim that experiences changes as the story progresses. So it is safe to say that Jim Nolan is the protagonist of In Dubious Battle. And then, you know, we looked at Of Mice and Men, looking at The Grapes of Wrath. As in that novel, what you have here is Steinbeck chronicling the lives of poor people or workers, or both, you know, but with a big difference, because in this novel, In Dubious Battle, the narrator is going to remain quite a lot more detached than he does, for example, in The Grapes of Wrath. Here you have no direct plea for the workers, no poetic, lofty passages about the struggle for life and decency, none of that, which are the elements that so many critics, you know, criticized when looking at The Grapes of Wrath, right? For political, aesthetic reasons, or a mixture of both. But that is not to say that Steinbeck remains completely detached in this novel, In Dubious Battle. Okay, it is very easy to see once you read the story where his sympathies lie. So the central topic of In Dubious Battle, on the one hand, you could say, yes, this is a novel about a strike. Okay, that is basically the most basic way of describing the novel, a novel about a strike. It is also a Bildungsroman that follows Jim Nolan, but I would say that the central topic of this novel is actually the crowd, in the sense that Elias Canetti, for example, spoke of crowds and power in that famous work. So this is what we're looking at here. Mac is a veteran organizer of strikes, and then on the other hand, Jim is kind of a rookie, right? But he's a guy who has also read quite a bit of theory. So in a sense, what the novel is doing is presenting us with two characters, one who represents practice and the other one who represents theory. And together they realize that a crowd is not simply a group of individuals. Okay, a crowd is the sum of its parts, but constituting a separate entity, I would say, an animal, as Jim puts it in the novel. And both of these characters, Mac and Jim, they come to realize that this animal has a life and the will of its own, and that at the end of the day, neither of them really understand this animal, this strange creature that is the crowd. So I wanted to talk a little bit, touch upon the notion of objectivity when it comes to In Dubious Battle, because this, I think, is important. In this novel, we have, the portrayal of a strike, okay, organized by the Communist Party in sympathetic terms, I would say. So it's not really a big surprise that the novel was criticized in its time. But here's the interesting thing. The novel was not attacked only from one side of the political spectrum. When the attacks did come, they came from both sides. So I think, in a sense, that kind of tells you that this is a rather objective novel, because it was attacked from both sides. And in my opinion, I'm going to say that I believe that In Dubious Battle is as objective a novel as it is possible to be objective. Objectivity is kind of an ideal, but I believe that it is rather objective. And one of the reasons, just to give you an example, is that I noticed that the character of Mac, he is the member of the Communist Party, or the party as they put it in the novel, he is the actual organizer of the strike, is not always presented in positive terms. Okay, and he actually has quite Machiavellian views on how individuals can be used to further the cause, which I found to be quite disturbing, to be honest. So you can see that there's no Manichaeism here. It's not like, the good guys and the bad guys, the white and the black, or however you want to put it. This is a rather objective novel, at least in that sense, okay? And regarding style, In Dubious Battle is primarily a novel that is driven by dialogue. Okay, so what you have is, as in many other works by John Steinbeck, hearing the characters, we just hear the characters in their own language as they navigate tough times. Okay, so yes, in that sense, this is quite representative of the work of John Steinbeck. And for the most part, this is something that I really like. Steinbeck, what he does is to let the characters voice their ideas and their opinions, as opposed to taking us, the readers, inside their minds. Okay, so I think that is a very interesting approach. Descriptions, you're going to notice, are very brief, but quite vivid. And this is just exactly the technique that made Of Mice and Men such a great work. Okay, so what you're seeing here is that in many ways, In Dubious Battle is a kind of a practice work. It's practice to reach something like Of Mice and Men, something like The Grapes of Wrath. But at the same time, I do want to say that I think this book is great, just in and of itself. A word on the title. Okay, I thought we might discuss that because it's a rather strange title. But as you may know, Steinbeck has this thing with, taking titles from famous works. Of Mice and Men is an example. The Moon is Down is another, and The Winter of Our Discontent, right? There are many in which he's taking the title from a famous work, and this is no exception. Okay, as you may know, the title of In Dubious Battle comes from John Milton's Paradise Lost, and as a matter of fact, in the novel you have an epigraph that quotes the passage where that line appears. And this is a description of Lucifer's uprising against God. Okay, and the key word I think here is dubious, right? How is this battle dubious? That's one question that we may have. So I want to read you what Warren French, critic, somebody who has studied John Steinbeck, said about the title, because I think he nailed it. He said it a lot better than I could. So let me just share what Warren French says, in this idea of what does it mean by dubious in this case. So French says, just as Lucifer was foredoomed not to triumph over God's omnipotence, the odds in Steinbeck's earthly confrontation are hopelessly against the nervous strikers from the beginning. What is dubious about the battle is not its outcome, but its causes and its consequences. Why should factions be driven to such violence against each other? And who finally are the losers in such a struggle, despite temporary victories? So let me share with you my impressions. I think In Dubious Battle is just a pleasure to read. Okay, I enjoyed it so much. And just for a little bit of context, I consider Of Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath to be Steinbeck's best work. Adding to that, The Red Pony, a highly underrated work. I want to share my views with you on that, so look out for a separate video on that one. And I'm also going to add East of Eden. Okay, many people criticized that novel, but I thought it was amazing. Okay, I spent probably like a week, I think it was a spring break, when I read that back in the day, when I was in college, and I really enjoyed it. So unfortunately, if I have to be honest, In Dubious Battle doesn't quite reach the narrative heights of those great works, but it definitely shows that Steinbeck was headed for greatness, because this, I think you could definitely say it's one of his first great works. This is Steinbeck before the masterpieces. Okay, and even though Tortilla Flat, for example, is a really good book, I enjoyed it very much. It's quite enjoyable, and you can see a lot of that sympathetic humor that is mentioned in the Nobel Prize citation. In Dubious Battle definitely represents a step forward in his career. So bottom line, In Dubious Battle is tragic, it is passionate, it is realistic. It marked my return, after such a long time, to Steinbeck's fictional world, and I absolutely loved that. Now, if you're new to Steinbeck, you may not want to start here. Okay, I would say go for Of Mice and Men, or directly for The Grapes of Wrath, which are considered to be the masterpieces. And if you have read either one of those or both, I really see no reason why you should not give In Dubious Battle a chance. I think if you enjoyed those, there's a big chance that you will also enjoy this one. And let's say you do decide to start with this one. Let's say you say, hey, Jorge, I'm not going to listen to you. I'm going to go directly for In Dubious Battle as my first experience of Steinbeck. Well, if you read it and you enjoy it, then that's wonderful too, because then you have the masterpieces to look forward to. So that's an amazing thing too. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? I'm always happy to hear them. Those were my 2 cents on In Dubious Battle by John Steinbeck. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.